This is the ZV1 Mark II, a brand new vlog camera from Sony. And I don't think I've ever been more confused about a camera than this one. Today we'll be talking about the pros, the cons, and doing some real-world examples, all to find out if it's the right camera for you. This camera is so small, it's pocketable. It's 4K, has great autofocus, a built-in ND filter, picture profiles, tons of customization, multiple audio options, and tons of cool new things. And today we're talking about all of it, starting with the form factor. For starters, this camera is super small. I really love how compact it is. It has nice touchscreen controls for the menu as well as for when you're actually shooting. It also features Sony's newer menu design, which is way better. I do wish it had a little bit bigger of a grip. It's, a little bit harder to hold when you're behind the camera shooting, but when you're in front of the camera vlog style, it's very lightweight and comfortable. This camera does offer 4K in both 24 frames per second and 30 frames per second. And in HD, it can go up to 120 frames per second. Let's see some examples. All right, we're here at the courts right now, and we're gonna be testing out the slow motion features of this camera.
I gotta say it and say it and say it again. Me and the devil ain't making amends. I've been a rebel since Lego and friends. I gotta make it and spin. I set the trend, king of the fall. Home with the winter, by spring I'll be gone. I don't be putting it all on the ground, so they never know what I'll be on my way. I need space to get the fake car. Get out my way. I need space, I'm about to take off. Get out my way. Had a frequency been way up, way up. Get out my way. It's too easy. It's a layup, layup. Get out my way.
These higher frame rates like 60 and 120 definitely create nice slow motion footage, but there is a little bit of that quality drop off going from 4K to HD. It would have been really awesome if they could have put 4K 60 in this camera. While in the S&Q mode, which is Sony's slow and quick mode, you can also do some stop motion style time lapses. Unfortunately, this camera does not have the super high frame rate options like the original. So no 960 frames per second. It's a little bit of a gimmicky thing, but it would have been cool to at least have the option in the Mark II. The lens on this camera is an 18 to 50 millimeter focal length. It is wider than the ZV1, which is super great. It needed to be wider, but it does not zoom as far. When you're zoomed out, you have a 1.8 aperture, but when you zoom all the way in, you're going to an f4 aperture. This is a significant downgrade from the original ZV1, which at 70 millimeters was 2.8. That would let in more light, gives you more depth, overall better quality. So for this camera, on the wider part of the lens, it's definitely better. But when you start to zoom in, it's actually worse. But comparisons aside, it is still very usable. This also has a built-in ND filter. All right, so we're out at the park right now, and as you guys can see, this image is pretty overexposed, but I'll be able to change that real fast by turning on the ND filter. You can think of this sort of like, sunglasses for your lens. It's going to allow you to use a more accurate shutter speed, which will give more realistic motion blur to your images. The autofocus on this camera is fantastic. It doesn't have any weird wobbles like I found on the ZV1F, which is a massive relief. You can actually toggle between human and animal autofocus modes, and it's got product showcase mode, which is super helpful for creators like us who are doing a lot of different reviews and you want to hold it up to the camera and no longer focus on your face, but focus on the product. All right, let's talk about the overall image and kind of like look of this camera. The color science in this camera is pretty great. Everything looks very pleasing. In addition to the just standard mode, there's also a lot of different picture profiles that you can access to really pull out the most that this camera can offer. It also has a newer feature called CineVlog. This is a quick way to get cinematic looking footage. It's basically just some black bars and a filter. I like that it has it as an option, and I could see maybe some people experimenting with it, but overall it's a bit gimmicky. If you know anything about editing, you can easily accomplish this look, and you would have full control after the fact. The low light on this camera is actually pretty good. Here's what it looks like as compared to an iPhone. And something that I've been super impressed with is intelligent auto mode. In this mode, the camera is essentially going to detect what type of scene is happening and adjust the exposure accordingly. I found it does a great job keeping my face exposed in changing scenarios. But with that said, there's definitely still going to be times where you want to take full control of the camera because maybe what it's doing just isn't what you want it to be doing. And that's why I created supersimplecamerasettings.com. This is my free course where I break down the fundamentals. As great as some of these cameras are, it's still really important as a content creator to know the fundamentals of how to expose images well. This way you're not subject to what the camera is doing and you can actually take control and create what you see in your head. You'll be able to go from auto to manual in minutes. You can check it out at supersimplecamerasettings.com. When it comes to audio, this definitely has some noticeable upgrades from the original ZV1. The main difference is that you actually have some options with this camera, much like the Sony ZV-E1. You can actually choose between the front mic, the back mic, or an omnidirectional mic.
I'm downtown right now next to this fountain, and I thought this would be a good environment to do an audio test. So right now I'm actually using the front setting of the microphone, which is more like your traditional shotgun style mic. So as I turn around, you'll notice that the water fountain is getting just a smidge quieter, which is really handy. But what if I actually want to include the water fountain in the shot and in the audio? I can actually change it to omnidirectional. Now the camera is picking up all directions around the microphone capsule, so you'll be able to hear me and the waterfall. Or I can actually change this again to the back setting. You probably can't hear me quite as good right now, and the water fountain's probably really loud, but I can actually turn this around, and now I can talk and show you guys the water fountain as well as the rest of the downtown area by talking into the back mic, which is really useful if you want to show where you're at and narrate it.
While the audio is pretty decent, personally, I wouldn't rely only on that. For longer talking head videos like this, I would utilize something like my DJI mics or, a higher quality shotgun mic. And the really nice thing about this camera is you can totally do that with the audio input. So when it comes to battery life, it's okay. It's really not the best. The reality is they use these tiny little batteries in these point and shoot cameras, and they just don't get you near the amount of battery life as, some of the bigger battery options. But I did do a battery test comparing this to the Sony ZV-E10 and the Sony ZV-1, and to my surprise, this camera did actually outperform both of those cameras, but not by much, only by like minutes. So I would say on a good day in a friendly environment, for continuous recording, you might be able to get an hour.
Stabilization is off. We're doing a skateboard test. So we're riding the skateboard, no stabilization. This is what it looks like. And now we've got active stabilization on. Here's the skateboard test with active stabilization.
When it comes to stabilization, I'm happy that in active stabilization mode, there's not like a super massive crop. It's more of a minimal crop. I also love that the performance of the stabilization overall is definitely better than the ZV-1 and the ZV-E10. And if you leave stabilization off, you can also choose to use Catalyst Browse, which works really well. It just takes a lot of time and effort and energy, and is probably not something most people will choose to do. On one hand, the stabilization is performing better, but on the other hand, I wish it was performing even better. It's just not quite up to the standard that I want it to be at. It's usable, but it's not fantastic. All right, so let's talk about the webcam situation. So Sony made this so, you're supposed to be able to just plug this right into the computer and it will become your webcam. And in theory, that's great. But in actual execution, it's not that great, because when you do this, the resolution taps out at 720, not even 1080, 720. I guess it's cool that you can just plug it in, but to me, 720 is not good enough. The good thing is you can go the more traditional route and utilize a capture card to actually get 4K out of this camera. but it just costs, an extra $100 or so for a good quality one. And, in that sense, it's not really a feature of this camera, it's a feature of the capture card. So I don't know. It's cool that you can use it, I guess, but to me, the webcam feature is kind of pointless because it's 720. Photography with this camera is interesting. It's a small little compact camera. It reminds me of like a very small like street photography style camera. It captures in RAW, which is great. It's about 20 megapixel photos, which is fantastic. A lot of photography is going to come down to the lens, and the reality is, because of the lack of the zoom and the f4 on the long end of this lens, it's not going to be like the most fantastic photos when you're zooming in. In fact, the original ZV1 would be better suited for this. But all in all, it's lightweight, compact, fun and easy to use. I'm glad that you can do photos with it, and they edit out pretty nice. So let's talk about how this compares to the original ZV1. It seems like a little bit more of a fix than an upgrade. It fixes the lens width, but loses the reach and aperture. It fixes the battery door opening, but offsets the screw. It gives you some newer image features, but loses the super high frame rates. It does fix a lot of things, but it also costs more. And this higher price tag is significant. I think this price would have been more justified if there had been, upgrades to the actual image quality. If they would have included 4K 60 in this camera, it would have been a lot more of a home run. But with all of this being said, I'm going to be selling my ZV1 and switching to the ZV1 Mark II because I'm able to get a better performance out of this camera without needing to use a cage or a lens adapter. This allows me to keep the setup small and compact like it's intended. And personally, I'm totally fine with the focal length trade-off. I would take wider over zoom reach any day. Overall, I'm finding this camera way more usable for vlogging than the original ZV1. And the cool thing is I'm finding I'm already recording more with it because it's just easier and more fun to bring with me. This is a pretty niche camera, and all in all, it's designed for vlogging. But you might be a creator who does more than just vlogging. If that's the case, and if you're in the market for, a camera that's actually more affordable than this one that can get you some cool results, then you should check out this camera here. I placed links to all of this stuff in the description below. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, stay creative. Peace.